Now, Executive Suites with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Well, we all know the stories of Apple or Google getting founded in a garage, and now they're massive, profitable companies with huge numbers of employees and huge revenue, huge profits, and it's the dream, of course, of many places to be home to enterprises like that. So today we're going to talk about a new effort to get some of those people starting companies with those kind of dreams to come together in Rhode Island and talk about their common goals and their common needs. And we're here talking about that with the founder of the Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs, the executive director, Pat Sabatino, and the legislative affairs director for the Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs, Dan Reilly. You may also remember Dan from his days as a state representative. We've all had our wayward moments in life, Dan, so you're fully recovered from that, right?
Young and made mistakes. I'm trying to reconcile now.
That's right. But Dan is here wearing his hat as a founder of a company called Legably, as well as his role in this coalition of entrepreneurs. And Pat Sabatino is the founder and CEO of a company called Datarista. So we're going to talk later in the show about your companies and what you guys are doing, your day jobs. But first I want to talk about this coalition, this new group. Pat, I think we're going to start with you because you were the driving force behind getting this together. So let's start with just the basics for folks. What is the Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs?
Sure. It is an advocacy group to represent the needs of startups. And by startups, we don't mean anyone who's starting a business, but really high growth businesses, ones that aspire to get venture funding and have hundreds of employees one day. I was involved with several startups on the West Coast and came back to the East Coast and found that there was not a lot of connectivity here between the different businesses. There wasn't a single common voice trying to represent the need. So took it upon myself to try to put it together, try to get the founders of all these businesses together and get everyone rowing in the same direction to a common cause.
And how big is it now? How many members do you have and sort of what industries do they span?
So we currently have 40 members in the coalition, and we seem to be adding about 2 or 3 a month right now. We believe, from what we can see, about 125 startups exist in the state of Rhode Island, geographically dispersed about the state and spread across a number of verticals. We have 5 or 6 in health and life sciences. We have a couple in enterprise software. There's a great agriculture, food science sector, a number of different sectors.
So Dan, you, as I said, Pat was the founder initiator in this. You got in on the ground floor a bit, joining the board, the folks trying to run the thing, get it off the ground. What was the appeal to you when you heard about it, and what have you heard from others who've been joining up about why they like the idea of getting involved?
Well, certainly as a founder of a small company, seeking venture funding, you're at that level. It's great to be around other companies that are experiencing the same things you are. And with me and my background on more of the public policy side of things, I saw the value right away, and I was very happy to be a member because in Rhode Island we really have an addiction to the big shiny things, and we're attracted to try to invest in companies sometimes or otherwise attract them in. And really what the coalition and Rice is trying to show is that the real value, the big companies, like you said in the opening, of tomorrow are going to start as the small companies of today. So while we may not be the Chamber of Commerce, we do have some different objectives than the groups that have traditionally represented business, and we're trying to bring those to the forefront because otherwise there would be companies that sometimes are just one person and they don't have the time or the bandwidth to bring those issues to the State House or to the front of people's minds, or
maybe even the money for the fee for a chamber membership or something like that. I'm glad you mentioned the Chamber of Commerce, and nothing against the Chamber of Commerce, Pat. It does seem like I feel like I've covered a number of organizations that sound at least somewhat like this over the years, trying to bring together, often in the tech community, or trying to bring together startups, trying to get people talking to each other. What's the difference here, or is it just that those have never gotten a critical mass? How would you differentiate this effort?
I think we're different both in the makeup of the group and in the goals of the group, right? So, on one hand, we've had some wonderful organizations that have been out there for startups and the innovation economy, but they haven't been limited to just the CEOs and founders of the businesses. They've been open to anyone with an interest, anyone who may have been in a startup in the past, who aspired to be in one in the future. And that's great. That's really good. That's a very useful and important thing. When it came to the purpose of Rice, I thought, there needed to be, originally the idea was it was going to be a networking group, right? Maybe someone had raised an A round in the past, or someone understood how to structure convertible debt, or maybe even someone just knew a marketing freelancer, and we as founders and entrepreneurs could help each other with our experiences and our connections. It kind of grew, though, into having its own unique identity in that I started to look at how my business has been funded and how it's grown in the state. We've raised a little over $2.5 million. 2/3 of that money came from outside of the state, but about 85% of my expenses are spent here in the state, and 100% of my company's revenue comes from out of the state. Now, that as a single business is a really nice story, but I started to realize if we could aggregate 30, 40, 50, 60 companies like this in the state, we are an economic block, and we are doing wonderful things in providing jobs and new businesses here in the state. So unlike, I think, some other groups of the past, this new economic development angle is kind of unique to us.
Dan, I'm curious, as you've had some meetings, I think all of you talking together, the 40 members or so, what do you hear? What are the common themes? You guys have alluded a bit to it, I suppose, already, but spell that out. What are the positives? What are the negatives? What are the things that come up a lot when you're all talking about running a startup in Rhode Island?
Well, I think one of the issues that's always first and foremost in everyone's mind is the access to capital.
You always hear that, yeah.
Always an issue, definitely probably more pronounced at our stage of companies than any other stage.
And for people who aren't as familiar with it, spell out what that concern really is at the ground level for the companies.
It's the ability for our local companies to tap into a network of local investors who understand the local environment. They know who is starting companies. They know who was involved previously. They're easy physically to access, but it seems like anyone could get on a plane and go visit people, but that has a huge effect, close proximity to investors, when you're an entrepreneur trying to raise funds for a company. And so that is chief among everyone's concerns.
Yeah, I would add to that, Rhode Island has a dearth of available capital for investment for pre-revenue companies, the earliest phase. And that proximity factor is important because quite often if you're a large investor, you want a board seat. And you don't want to have to fly to Providence for one day for a company that's well outside your geographic footprint.
That's interesting because you worked on the West Coast, and you said, we think in this era with phones and email and everything else, who cares if you're investing in a company in Providence and you're sitting in Silicon Valley? But that matters, still matters.
It still does matter. And actually, technically, I lived in Rhode Island and commuted to Silicon Valley. I lived in Narragansett and worked in San Francisco. But it does matter. It does matter. They often will want to have an East Coast connection who will be a co-investor who they can kind of trust will show up for board meetings, especially once you get away from angel investors and you get into some of the more institutional investors. It matters a whole bunch.
And pre-product investors are investing in the people. They're not there isn't anything else to really invest in other than the idea. And so it's incredibly important. You can't really do that via PowerPoint over email and expect to close a deal. You can't get financing done that way in the vast majority of cases. So having that physical close proximity to be in the same market as people who are investing at that level and in those types of companies that are involved in that vertical is very important, and that's probably easily the number one concern of our membership.
We have to go to a break in a sec, but I want to ask one more question on this. I'm thinking of what the viewers might be thinking, and someone might say, well, yeah, Silicon Valley's far away, but Cambridge is up the road, 45 minutes. Why isn't Rhode Island able to tap into that early stage capital more? What would you say to that?
I think we do. I just don't think we do it as effectively as we could or should. There's still kind of the 93-128 loop around Boston that kind of walls off the empire a little bit. So, and we're the Huns on the other side of the wall trying to come over.
We need a Death Star, maybe. Yeah.
Yes, but we do have to do a better job of attracting that money down here, and New York money as well. And I think that's part of the purpose of some of our goals.
Interesting. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk more about the companies these two fellows have founded that got them involved in this. Stick with us for that on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and we are talking to two of the founding members of the new Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs. We're taping this the start of 2018, got off the ground middle 2017, is that fair to say?
July 2017.
July 2017. And the two fellows I'm joined by are Pat Sabatino, the Executive Director of the Coalition of Entrepreneurs, and Dan Reilly. He is their Legislative Affairs Director. I want to pivot a little because the reason you're in a Coalition of Entrepreneurs is because you're both entrepreneurs, and I want to hear a little about the companies you guys have founded. Dan, I'm going to start with you because I remember when I was covering you in the legislature, you were in law school, I think part of that time, and you're a lawyer, and your company is called Legably. Am I saying it right? Legably.
That's right.
And it comes out of what you've learned about the legal profession. Talk about what you do.
Well, coming out of law school and being a practicing lawyer, especially a young practicing lawyer, you very quickly get to see the industry and how it works close up, warts and all. And one of the things I found was that there are many small law firms, including one that I was working for, that have issues with clients, and you want to meet their needs and you want to be able to scale up for work, but you just don't have the volume to justify hiring a full-time associate or using a temp agency. And so that's where the idea for Legably came about. Legably is a marketplace that connects freelance attorneys with small to medium-sized law firms and corporate legal departments who need short-term help but don't want to hire a temp agency that would have lawyers under contract. So if you love them, you have to buy them out of their contract and they end up being a permanent temp employee for their life. Or they just don't have the volume of work to justify hiring a full-time associate, which we all know, when you look at employment numbers coming out of law schools, is a very big problem for new attorneys. So Legably offers a solution for those attorneys and for those firms to really match them up, allow them to have stronger incomes, to really build up a portfolio of work perhaps outside of a full-time firm job.
It reminds me a little of like TaskRabbit or Angie's List, the connecting of the person with the skills to the person who needs them.
Absolutely. TaskRabbit, Angie's List for lawyers.
Yeah, that's it. So how is it going so far? Do you have a lot of lawyers on there?
It's good. We have about 3,000 lawyers on right now.
All over the country?
They're all over the country. We're open in all 50 states. We've actually had a fair number of signups internationally, even though right now we're not offering our services internationally because there are a lot of market-by-market issues you have to work through before you start offering legal services there. But we've seen incredible reception. Lawyers love it. They love the ability to be a freelance lawyer. They love, small firms love the ability to not have to necessarily hire someone they couldn't afford anyways, but not have to turn work out the door or refer it out to another law firm. So they're able to make more money, contribute to their bottom line. So right now we're just continuing to develop the product. We're fundraising, we're accessing capital, we're trying our best to in Rhode Island, and we go all over the country for that. But we're going through what every small tech startup in Rhode Island or anywhere else is going through. There's a lot of scaling, there's a lot of working through the nights, conference calls across time zones, but it's a great adventure. And I'm really proud to be able to start a company here in Rhode Island, and we'll keep the company here in Rhode Island, and hopefully it's going to be a very big company here in Rhode Island.
I believe you have a new baby, so you're going to need to pay some college bills at some point. Dan, Pat, you're a little further along in your career, but you are also starting a fairly new company. It's called Datarista. I think, was it 2015 you founded Datarista?
I founded it in 2015.
What do you do at Datarista?
So Datarista automates the integration of sales and marketing data to CRM and marketing automation platforms. That's a big mouthful for a lot of the population.
Yeah, right.
But essentially, there's this entire class of software called CRM and another class called marketing automation, and they basically handle the customers and prospects for most enterprise businesses, how you manage the sales process, the renewals process, and how you market to the top of the funnel, try to convert them into buying customers. There's a commercial.
So you got your prospects on one side, who you hope you become a customer, and then the people you're already working with, your clients, on the other.
Exactly. Now, to best handle your sales and marketing side of the house, you want to have additional fields of knowledge. For example, if you were operating a company that did fleet truck sales, you'd want to license data on the number of trucks in the fleet. The size of the box on the back of the truck. Does it have refrigerated unit on it? Does it, what makes and models do they lease? What are the lease expiration dates? What's the name of the guy who manages the fleet for that particular bakery or warehouse? There are companies that license that information, and traditionally that information has been delivered, pushed to the customer, but with the growth of the cloud and these new marketing automation and CRM systems growing in the cloud, we now have the ability to integrate that data so it's dynamic and live as a service inside of these platforms. It gets deep into the technical weeds, but it solves a lot of pain points around data velocity and the speed of information getting in the hands of sales and marketing.
So it sounds like the kind of thing where to the layman, it might not make a lot of sense, but if you're the person dealing with that problem, it could really solve something in your view.
To people in the space, it solves an enormous pain point and provides an enormous amount of opportunity in what you can now do in the future in selling and marketing to customers.
You mentioned earlier you've raised, I think, about $2.5 million since the company started to get it off the ground. How's business? How's it going so far?
Business is, with every startup, we were a little slower to market. You burned a little more cash. Nothing ever goes to plan. I've been through 4 startups. All of them had a successful exit prior to this one. And it was a rocky start in 2017 to our go-to-market strategy, but we're in market now. We've just signed our first major enterprise customer. We have 10 clients on the platform now, out of 450 global data providers. And our financials for 2018 actually look far better than we ever hoped.
You mentioned the rocky start in 20. I always like to ask about the more difficult time. We can get very positive on the show, and that's a good thing. But what lessons did you take out of that, or what did you have to turn to remain confident in what you were trying to do when things maybe didn't look like they were going to plan or perfectly?
Sure. Actually, Dan and I were talking about a little of this just before the show. I've never been involved in any startup who, before revenue was coming in, was made projections and actually stayed within 30% of those projections on expense, on revenue, because you don't have a crystal ball. So you go to build things that have never been built before, and you encounter things you just couldn't have foreseen. For us, we didn't have any technological hiccups. I have a fantastic team, and it is worth noting, I always like to say, when I found this startup here instead of California, I had a lot of blowback from my neighbors about you're never going to find the right talent, you're not going to find the money, you're not going to be able to do it here. And it's all garbage. I have some of the best developers. In my 35 years in the business, I have some of the best developers I've ever worked with that came here. I have 2 that I pulled off of trains that were commuting to Boston. I have one who worked in Boston, lived in Brookline, who relocated to Rhode Island to take this job here, lives on the east side of Providence now. But to answer that question, I had my particular problem was a little bit of customer adoption and go-to-market timing. It just took them a little longer to get into market with my product than I had anticipated.
And so you just have to be ready for that and have to roll with it as best you can.
I had to build into my future projections an extra 60 days of timeline for each of those customers to get to the
some of the same lessons we all learn in life, that sometimes things are going to go differently than you expected. All right, we're going to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the work of the New Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs and maybe some ideas on what could help that community to thrive in Rhode Island. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and we are talking today with 2 folks from the fairly new Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs. Pat Sabatino, he's the Executive Director, and Dan Reilly, he is the Legislative Affairs Director. And I wanted to go back to the topic we were talking about in the early part of the show, which was access to capital. As I was saying, it has come up for years in Rhode Island as an issue for early stage companies, a challenge. We were talking about the challenge of it. What could be potential solutions to that?
I think it's a matter of, there's 2 pieces, right? One is attracting capital from outside of the region, and the other is changing the mindset of capital inside the region. So when it comes to the former, we need a reason for them to want to be here, whether it is having a startup week where we could showcase our startups and have the appropriate speakers. They did something like this in Denver. It's been very successful. It gives the VCs in New York and Boston a chance to come and spend one day of really getting to know the ecosystem. Things like that can do a lot to bring the money into the region. There is also a lot of money in Rhode Island. It just tends to be more conservative. And I think that if we can start to put together some successful studies on the importance of startups in our local economy and the success metrics around startups, we can start to get some of these private family offices and other types of funds to break off a small piece of their fund to invest in, whether it's a hope fund or something that really ties into the local ecosystem. And see the benefits both for where you live and from a financial perspective.
And for people watching who might say, well, I have no plans to start a high-growth startup. Why should they care? Why should they care about this world?
Well, okay, so there's an awful lot when you deal with really early stage startups and a lot of math around success and failure. It's true. 60-70% of high growth, early phase startups are going to fail, right? And maybe 20% of them or so are just going to push and break even, make a little money, lose a little money. But that remaining 10% are going to be huge hits that cover, from a portfolio management perspective, the overall expense and return a really great return to investors. But more importantly, I have a startup here because I love living here, and you have a startup here because you love living here, and you work here because you love living. We all love the state. We love the beaches, the city, Newport, Block Island. This is our home, and it's important that we all invest in multiple ways in our local ecosystem, where we live, where we work, right, and make it a better place. And that's jobs, it's income for people that live here, it drives housing sales, it's all good for all of us.
And as more entrepreneurs start companies, we'd like to see, and we hope to see, more exits, and companies get acquired or otherwise achieve some sort of liquidity event. Maybe they go public. And now you have capital that's still here. We have entrepreneurs who now have access to capital from their own success, and they want to go pass it forward and invest in other companies, take their talents and continue to multiply, on their previous investments. So you see that in Boston, you see that in Silicon Valley. A lot of it is institutional capital that follows founders and follows access to talent, which are two big drivers of growth in those regions. But you also see founders of successful companies who still don't want to leave. They started a company, they stayed there. They have no intention of leaving, but now they have money and they want to deploy it. We have to do a better job as a state of really showcasing these companies that are their sweet spot for future investments, because right now, you have those people, albeit at a smaller level in Rhode Island in number, who are going to Boston, who are going to the West Coast. And either they're investing through a venture capital fund as a limited partner, or they're just investing personally directly into a company that's just not based here.
And I would add to that also, there's an awful, I don't wade into the political wars too often. I let Dan stay on that side of it. But there's an awful lot of discussion around the universities here and the amount of land they own, whether they pay taxes or don't pay taxes. And there's certainly a great way that they can collaborate with the state and with the startups in potentially looking at their endowments and maybe making small investments in an economic development fund for the betterment. They've got students who could be great interns. They have fledgling entrepreneurs themselves who need mentors. They have IP that could be potentially partnering with companies like ours to be licensed. There's a number of ways they can get involved that can be more than just the money, the help on the front end. But I think as a group, we're just starting to tackle these broader conversations, not for any one business, but holistically for the entire ecosystem. How do we get all the different institutions and constituents together and get everyone kind of working on the same page to a common goal?
Dan, 30 seconds, you mentioned to me off air, the comparison between running a campaign and running a startup. Oh,
absolutely. It's scrappy, you have limited resources, and you're the person who does absolutely everything. So I can't say that was my initial plan when I first decided to run for office, but I've discovered over time that running a political campaign has many parallels to running a startup company. I don't know how many people that's useful to, but I just happened to discover it.
I don't know if I trust everyone in a political campaign with my invested money, but that's a different story for another day.
Different show.
All right, Dan Reilly, Pat Sabatino, thank you both so much for coming on. It's the Rhode Island Coalition of Entrepreneurs. Pipe that into Google and you'll find it if it's something of interest to you. Thanks for joining us this week on Executive Suite, and every week, remember, you can sign up to get every episode as a podcast on iTunes or listen to it Sunday nights at 6:30 on WPRO. See you next week back here on Executive Suite.